Our next story, we're going to talk about Colombia. Yesterday, on July 20th, Colombian Independence Day, President Gustavo Petro gave his last speech as president of the South American nation. In this fiery speech, Petro declared that as of August 7th, Colombia would no longer be a sovereign country, and rather that it was once again shifting to the status of a viceroyalty. Petro declared, the government of Colombia will no longer belong to Colombia. Donald Trump, U.S. President, Marco, will always issue orders to the person they, rather than simply helping, actually imposed as Colombia's president. Petro once again repeated allegations that the electoral process should be declared illegitimate and null because of foreign interference, and that this means that incoming President Abelardo de la Espriella will always, quote, always be servant to the U.S. leaders who helped, quote, elect him. Vowing to resist the incoming government on the streets, Petro declared that the incoming government is illegitimate. To put it mildly, this is pretty strong rhetoric for an outgoing president. On the other hand, Abelardo de la Espriella has accused Petro of plotting a coup against him and has sounded the alarms about a possible attack that could take place the day he takes office on August 7th. In his July 20th Independence Day speech, he said that fumigations, which is used frequently, again, in the quote, war on drugs, and bombings would return to Colombia. So to understand what is happening in this pretty crazy presidential transition and what to expect from the incoming far right-wing president, we are joined by Javier Guerrero, a Colombian Los Angeles-based activist. Javier, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Zoe. Hi, Rania. Great to be back with y'all and talk about this.
Well, we were very excited to get you back on here because, you know, the elections happened, there were allegations of fraud, and since then, instead of kind of cooling down once the results were accepted, it has actually heated up, and we've seen a very tense transition period. So can you give our audience an overview of what has been happening in this time between the second round election and this upcoming swearing in of De La Espriella? Again, there's been back and forth over fraud, over attacks, a break in the transition process, and more.
Yeah. I mean, what a show, what a back and forth it's really been since the victory of Abelardo in the second round. You know, President Petro and a lot of people inside the historic PAF party have really questioned the legitimacy of the political process, especially because this unprecedented foreign political intervention from the U.S., other right-wing governments in the region as well, and obviously most recently claims by Israel as well. So the main thing, really, how things fully escalated is this thing with the empalme, this ceremonial transfer of power that was suspended. Called off by De La Espriella, and is now instead just going to be done on the TV. De La Espriella announced that he was suspending talks with the Petro cabinet over handing over of information that they usually have to do. And basically, he raised the alarms, as you said, talk about that there's this ongoing coup. And actually even told the armed forces to disobey any orders given by Petro, and technically Petro is still the president until August 7th, right, when he takes over. So basically, he's inciting sedition, inciting, the troops under his name to basically disobey the orders from an standing president. So Petro did this, and another reason why Petro suspended the empalme was because De La Espriella just continued these bogus threats of extradition against him. And saying that, and basically that he was going to turn the empalme, this ceremonial transfer of power, into a whole public show and public persecution of the Petro administration. And I think it's important to remind people there is currently no active investigation in the U.S. So all these charges against Petro are bogus. But with the incident in Venezuela, with the kidnapping of Maduro, I think these threats have to be taken very seriously. So for this reason, Petro not just suspended the empalme, but also proceeded to recognize the election as illegitimate. And then lastly, one of the things I would say is de la Espriella on August 7 also wants to inaugurate his presidency inside of a military base in Popayán, in the state of Cauca. And for people that know Colombia, the state of Cauca is the same place where Francia Marquez is from, the same place where Aida Quilce is from, a place where the historic victims of state and paramilitary violence live. Not to mention a place where De La Espriella terribly lost in the elections. They don't even like him there. So it's really a slap in the face. And what he's doing by doing it inside of a military base, or wanting to do it inside of a military base, I don't know how people are going to be transferred there. I don't know how this is going to be done, and who's actually even going to be in attendance. But what he's doing is a symbolic signaling that he's restarting the war against Colombians, against the civil populations, against the indigenous and Afro-Colombian populations, against environmentalists, against trade unionists. That's literally what his signals with this. And I mean, and he keeps doing this thing. I mean, he also plans to set up his office in Barranquilla, where he says that he's from, although he was born in Cordoba, where he also lost terribly. I mean, De La Esprilla's president, he was, for those that don't know Colombia, he's deemed as the costeño president. He's from the coast of Colombia, but yet he couldn't even win in the entire coastal region, or even in his hometown of Barranquilla on Atlántico. But really, I think we got to step back. This crisis and this transition really reflects, I think, a deeper crisis, which is the fact that Colombians ruling elite bloc is trying to reorganize after this first defeat that they suffer, right, against the first progressive government in Colombia's history. And the conflict that we're seeing right now, this tension, is an expression of these completing projects that represent different sectors of the population. One represented by the ruling elite, which is De La Espriella, and the other represented by Iván Cepeda, Petro, and Colombian movement. So they're not just simple disagreements between the two.
One thing, as you've mentioned, that Petro has repeated is this claim that the electoral process was illegitimate and that there was U.S. and even Israeli interference. So I'm wondering if you could tell us how true this claim seems to be.
Well, it has to be looked at, right? I mean, he published the lawsuit last night on a tweet. He claims basically that IP servers located in Los Angeles remove algorithm hash logs, these preventive measures, and digital timestamps from the E14 forms, which are the forms where it has the ballots, right? The forms that were mandatory, actually. These algorithm hash logs, these digital timestamps that were mandatory in recent cycles. And it's actually an investigation that is supported by more than 70,000 digital witnesses, Colombian, people, experts in digital security. It is an investigation that is supported by more than 70,000 people in Colombia. He also talks about the fact that there's co-vulnerabilities because the election machines are run by private softwares that are used by the National Registry, and that although there's been major irregularities and major vulnerabilities since 2014, they haven't corrected them. So basically Colombia's cyber defense is in the hands of U.S. and Israeli companies, which are under the jurisdictions of this government. So it really brings to question the sovereignty of the elections. And when it comes to Israel in particular, Pedro has raised these serious allegations against an Israeli private intelligence firm called Black Cube. And Black Cube, for those that don't know, has actually been previously involved in controversial political and corporate operations in several countries. So the allegations are not only technical, but they're also politically significant because they touch on Colombians' really long history of foreign interference, especially from the United States. So I think it definitely deserves a minimum investigation. Now, whether these allegations ultimately prove correct or not, I think they do become part of this larger debate about sovereignty, about foreign interference, about also Colombian strategic positioning in the hemisphere, right? Because one thing that is true, one thing that is a fact, is the fact that Donald Trump publicly endorsed Abelardo de la Espriella before Colombians voted and explicitly threatened voters to vote for de la Espriella if they wanted a better relationship and support from the United States. This is an extraordinary level of intervention by a president of any foreign power in the elections of a country. Not to mention, we talked last time about Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, who also was meeting with De La Espriella even before he was even president, to talk about policy. So once again, whether you accept or, we're going to have to wait. And I do think this investigation has to be paid attention to. But whether Petro's conclusion is right or not, I think the historical context matter. Colombia has received decades of U.S. military aid through Plan Colombia. Colombia has been the site for strategic U.S. military bases, which has also been a huge site of struggle inside the country. I know there was a lot of talk during the World Cup about Argentina being the Israel of Latin America. I never want to fight for being the Israel of Latin America, but Colombia has a track record of being the strategic military garrison in the Israel of Latin America for decades, because right-wing administrations have traditionally been aligned with Washington. So when Colombians hear about U.S. presidents openly backing one candidate, I think we have to interpret this and look at it through the long history of intervention. But I really think what I want to go back to is the larger point that I think Petro is making, that this is political rather than just technical. He's arguing that the sovereignty is not only about how the ballots are counted, but also whether Colombians are free to determine their future without the pressure from literally the most powerful state in the world.
No, I think it's a really important point, and it's hard to imagine that this would not, if for example, Trump is out here alleging that electoral fraud took place in 2020 because he wasn't elected. And one can only imagine if the U.S.'s biggest trading partner were to say, vote for X candidate because the relationship will be more favorable. And again, this is something we've spoken on the show about before, not only with relation to Colombia, but also the elections in Honduras. And I think especially with the upcoming elections in Brazil, this is going to be a major factor as well. And I think we can expect similar behavior by Trump with relation to Flavio Bolsonaro. But, Javier, I wanted to ask you a bit about De La Espriella's kind of declared policies so far. He's talked a lot about what his government will do once he takes office. During his campaign, he said that he would disembowel the left, that he would tear up the peace process and defund key projects. What is the government plan of De La Espriella? What can we expect from these first weeks? And is there fear among the left and progressive forces of what this government could mean for them? And I want to remind people that Colombia used to be the most dangerous country for trade unionists. It is a country where there was a genocide of a left political party, the Unión Patriótica, and where there's been a lot of historic political violence against the left.
Yeah, I first want to start by saying, while Colombia has a huge history of bravery and resistance, I do think there's a lot of fear, and the fears are very valid because of the history that you talked about. So I really do feel that, we're kind of heading towards kind of like an uncertain future under this far right-wing government in a sense. They promised basically to right off the top dismantle the peace process and negotiations. They didn't even. They closed the peace process offices already. That was one of the first things that he did. He basically wants to bring back and step up neoliberalism in the area, align himself with Washington and all their policies in the regions. So in many ways, it's also not just De La Espriella. It's also not just another right-wing government. I think the concern by many is that he represents this convergence of Uribismo, which is the traditional right wing in Colombia, with the new Latin American far right angry tide and MAGA in a sense, right? Many on the left describe De La Espriella not because he kept saying that he's an outsider, but he's really Uribismo rebranded for the social media era basically. This whole he's doing the MAGA playbook. Packaging himself as an anti-establishment, but the fact is it's the same people that he's going to bring on, and I want to talk a little more about that actually. But some of the policies, an economy basically based on oil and coal, now completely aligned under the supervision of Trump. Restrepo, one of his cabinet members, went to Washington D.C. with several other ministers. That was their first visit. And Omar Bula, his foreign minister, already met with the Israeli foreign minister and agreed to reopen the embassy in Israel and normalize relationship with Israel, and not just reopen the embassy, but move it to Jerusalem, right? And not to mention this guy Omar Bula, his foreign minister is a climate change denier. He's an anti-vaxxer. He's a racist. The typical right-wing political cocktail. And I think if we look at his cabinet, we could see what's coming. And also the hypocrisy of his life, of what he ran, and the lie that he ran under his campaign, that he was an outsider, right? That he was an outsider, but he's in fact bringing all the insiders. If you look at his cabinet, he kept saying, "Oh, I want a government of those that have never lived of milking of the benefits of the state, those that are not from the establishment, that are not political insiders, those who have never robbed a peso from the government." Well, if we look at his cabinet, of the 15 ministers that he appointed, 5 of them already have actually held federal government positions with other presidents, right? Esa Noguera in particular, I want to talk about her because she's from Barranquilla as well, where I'm from and where he's supposedly from. She's basically the daughter of the clan of the Chars. The Chars are this family in Barranquilla who literally have made the Northern Atlanticos province their private property through alliance with death squads, through corruption and fraud and electoral fraud. And not to mention that her husband is an actual convicted drug trafficker and he's in jail right now. So talk about an outsider. Three other cabinet members were already in Congress from traditional political parties. And the rest, while they have not held any office or position, are the sons and daughters, friends, or business associates of the ruling political elite of Colombia. So that's already 10 out of 13 insiders in this outsider government, and he still has actually 3 more to choose. So I think I mean, and even looking at some of the gains that that already are trying to be reversed, there's already have been reported land thefts by groups of armed men from campesinos and victims of the armed conflicts who were actually given land by Petro through his landmark land reform, because where he took away land from convicted drug traffickers and paramilitaries and gave it to campesinos, and now they're once again in fear. Literally, on the eve of the elections, these land thefts began right away, and I think this was being signaled. So really, what many fear a lot of is that a lot of the gains by the Petro administration will be reversed. So you could have a lot of criticisms about Petro, but I think his environmental policy was widely popular. The economic policy resulted in the lowest unemployment figures in the last 25 years. Poverty fell from 36% to 28%, showing once again that poverty is a policy choice, right? Mm-hmm. And not to mention the fact that he paid off the IMF debt. So I do think that these are some of the things that De La Espriella are signaling is to come.
So I want to ask you about the fight back here, because De La Espriella's antagonistic discourse has not been met with apathy, right? A lot of different political leaders, organizations, social movements have vowed to resist his program of government on the streets and with a renewed commitment to struggle. So talk to us about the fight back, and what are the central pillars that people are going to defend?
In the face of the De La Espriella government and all of this adversity, leaders of the outgoing administration and also mass movements have vowed and pledged to resist, to mobilize people, and really create a huge opposition bloc, right? Petro at that July 20th rally talked about that if they threaten any of the gains, including once again the land reform that was given, free public university for Colombian youth, and many of the things, that basically it's time for a second cry of independence, is what he said. He's signaling once again this on July 20th, right on the day of Colombian independence. And the way that how he's proposing, and a lot of people are really open to, is his idea of using a permanent general strike, an indefinite and permanent general strike of millions, right, to defend the gains, right, to build, to mobilize millions and build a network of masses of people to fight back against the right-wing administration. But I think one thing that's overlooked really is the fact that the resistance in Colombia really goes beyond Petro and Cepeda, right, and the historic PAF party. and has not really been solely dependent on elections. We have to remember this is the first progressive government in Colombia's entire history, right? But Colombia has been a country of some of the most fierce resistance and recorded resistance, right? Historically, every major period of social change in Colombia has been driven not by the governments, but by organized political movements. So regardless of who occupies the Casa de Nariño, the struggle over Colombia's future will continue in the workplaces, in the universities, in the rural communities, in the streets. Its strength has always come from these organized social movements, trade unions, peasant organizations, indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, feminist movements, student organizations, and the Victims Association of State Terror, right? And many of those organizations have already said that they intend to resist this really upcoming storm that is coming. They're pledging basically to protect the social gains achieved under Petro. And I think and that's because these gains don't belong to any administration, but they actually belong to the Colombian people, and any threat to them will be resisted. They're saying basically the old shout of no pasarán.
Well, really important there. And I just would want to add that De La Espriella has said that he wants to tear down the monument to resistance in Cali, which was erected during the 2021 uprising and national strike. It's a monument to resistance. It's a fist in the air. And he says this is one of the things he wants to tear down. So quite literally going after, the material and concrete symbols of resistance. So pretty clear what he wants to do there. But Javier Guerrero, thank you so much for joining us here on BT Live, again, for your excellent analysis, and we will definitely be calling you soon.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Rania.